Hey everybody, happy Monday. So gotta want to do a quick video because I got a response to my previous video about FI being the fairness generator. And the comment raises a couple of things that probably I should address or clarify just in case it's not clear. So I'd recommend just watching the video, but the short recap of the video is that I'm talking about how FI is basically, well, both FI and TI are what we call deliberation functions, right? So they're trying to figure out the answer to some question. And I would say it's sort of in the declarative domain, so something you can articulate. Trying to figure out the answer to some sort of solution. And TI is going to do it in this conditional logic way. If A, then B, you have A, therefore you have B. Or you don't have B, therefore you don't have A. That kind of stuff. Or, some dogs are poodles. This is a poodle. Is it necessarily a dog? Yes. Sorry, no, in that particular layout. But, even though it's factually, doesn't match up with the real world, logically, it's a valid conclusion. So in other words, TI is about these logical if-then types of statements, and you can plug and play different representations into what you mean by A and B. And as long as all the conditions are true that you're laying out, which is a big if, but as long as they are all true, and you come to a logical, valid conclusion, then that's going to necessarily be the case. Okay. So that's TI deliberation. Just try to figure out the answer to a question by using formal logic like that. Sometimes easier said than done. Okay. FI, on the other hand, is also a deliberation function where you're trying to figure out the answer to a question, but instead of using conditional logic in the sense of TI, where, again, as long as all the conditions are true, then your result is going to be necessarily true. It's more about judging fairness or coming up with an answer that is fair. And what do you mean by fair? Well, that can differ from person to person, what they think is fair. It's going to be based off of their own sort of FI values, their own FI principles. And so when people talk about lead FI users having their own value system or strong value system, yes, it's very subjective. It's based off of, their culture, their family, their own personal experience, their own intuition about the world. All of that stuff is feeding into it. But ultimately, they're going to, come up with an answer or a solution to a question on what they ultimately think is the fair answer. Now, a lot of times, in the everyday sort of parlance, when we talk about it, people look at FI type processing and think of it as logical or reason processing because, based off of my own values and based off of my own code, then this is clearly the answer. This is clearly what we should be doing. But it's not necessarily the case. Other people could have different values. Now, you can disagree with whether they should have those value systems, but they do. And so that's what makes it a little bit more of a subjective sort of function than what TI would be. Okay. And I do understand that a lot of people think of fairness and coming up with a fair response as an FE thing. Let's put that aside. I don't think it is. I'm happy to explain why in another video, but I don't want to get detracted here. Okay, so we've got these deliberation functions, TI and FI. And the point of my previous video is that in most legal situations where we're trying to figure out, who's at fault, or who has sort of the responsibility here, who has the duty. A lot of times it boils down to what's fair, what the judges in the particular case think is the fair result, given sort of the situation, the context, what we call the facts and circumstances of the situation. What ultimately does the judge feel is sort of the fairest approach? Okay, so I talked about this long line of cases back in the 1800s, early 1900s, when the railroads were being built in the United States. There were all these cases where landowners were suing the railroad companies because the trains would have sparks flying out of the engine because you had to use coal and fire to to for things to go. And so you had all these sparks just sort of randomly flying out in the countryside. And if the railroad got too close to a farmer's property, it could catch things on fire, like stacks of hay or the grass or crops or whatever. And so there was this really legitimate big legal issue that people had to wrestle with well, who's at fault here, and if the train's at fault, at what extent are they at fault? But and the because let me step back real quick, because figuring out who's at fault ultimately decides what path people take to solve the problem, and or what steps are they going to take to come up to a resolution. But at the very start of it, you have to deliberate and figure out, okay, in this situation, who is at fault? And again, like I said in the other video, there was this general principle that if you owned land, you could do whatever you wanted with it. And so the railroad companies owned the land on the railroad, or where the tracks were. And so they felt like they could do whatever they wanted with their land, and run their trains on it as they see fit. While the farmers, on the other hand, they own their land and they feel like, hey, I should be able to put my crops in my hay and, grow my grass as long as I want, without interference of anybody else. And so if you ran it through a computer that was just doing TI logic and didn't have any sort of FI processing, but wasn't looking at fairness, but was just looking purely at TI logic, you can't solve this problem, right? Unless you start adding a bunch of other conditions, but you only add those conditions because you're trying to figure out what's fair. So anyways, so if you just put something in a computer simulation that says, if you own land, you can do whatever you want with it, then there's not going to be an answer to who's at fault here, the train or the farmer. Now, of course, living in the time that we do, we tend to think like, well, it's obviously the train's fault. They're the ones sort of putting the harm out into the world. As the commenter said, this conflict is easily resolved if we operate on a non-aggression principle. So in other words, whoever the aggressor is, whoever's putting out the negative externality into the world, they're the ones who should be responsible. And I agree. And that's generally how our law in the US works. But it's not necessarily the case. In fact, I'd argue probably 95% of legal systems, up to the US, leading up to the US system, would probably find the other way around. Because the train, you have to think of how important trains were back in the early 1800s when they were first being developed, right? This isn't just a simple if then sort of exercise. You have to look at the context of the Transcontinental Railroad and how important it was to the US economy. And if you had all these farmers just lodging lawsuits one after another because something got burnt, the train saw this as kind of nuisance cases in a lot of respects, where the farmers were just sort of cashing in on the fact that maybe some of their their crop got damaged, and it's like, okay, buy insurance, you'll be fine. But of course, the farmers are like, why should I have to buy the insurance? You're the one setting my stuff on fire. Um, but you could imagine a legal principle where might makes right, or sort of the more important economic actor is to be protected, right? So there used to be this philosophy that, I forget who said it, but there's this famous quote of whatever is good for GM, General Motors, is good for the company or good for the country. So again, whatever is good for GM is good for the country. So in other words, we're going to let GM do what GM wants to do because it's ultimately good for the country, because it's such a large employer and it's so important to our economy, and we need cars for our economy, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're just going to sort of let them do what they want to do, right? As long as it's like within bounds, right? And that was, a leading sort of legal perspective or policy perspective for a long time. And so you can imagine the same would have been true back, in the 1800s with the trains of, whatever is good for the railroad industry is good for the country. And so we're going to do what we can to protect the railroad industry. It would be similar today, like if, somebody, if people were getting, sick or cancer or something from electrical wires or fiber optic internet cables or something. And, there's like, well, sorry, we can't just go without electricity just because a few people are getting sick, right? So then it's a sort of a question of, okay, well, who's going to be responsible for it or pay for it? And there are a lot of people out there that would just say, well, if you're getting sick, then move, move away from the electrical wires or whatever. So you could see that it's not so easy. Okay. It's not a TI type of situation where, as long as all the conditions are true, there is a necessary answer. Instead, we're sort of weighing out all the sort of motivations and the the facts and the circumstances, and um what sort of interest we want to protect, right? Or is it general welfare, or do we want to protect these corporations that are important? um so yeah. Okay. So the FI groundwork, like this commenter is saying, this is a different commenter here, that work treating everyone equally could be performed in TI calculus. Yeah, right. So yeah, I mean, I think that's basically aligning what I'm saying is you need the FI to sort of figure out, okay, what are the ground rules here? What's the framework we're going to use? So in the Sparks cases, you need your FI to sort of figure out, okay, what's fair in this situation? Is it fair to the landowners to, to make them responsible, or is it fair to the train? And I also point out that, again, we tend to think that this is an easy answer, but even a lot of courts were just sort of like, look, the farmers have, contributory negligence here. They put their hay too close to the railroad, or they let their grass grow too high. They were negligent in themselves. They should have known that this train was coming. And think of it like if you ever watched Game of Thrones, where the dragons are flying around and they're like, eating farmers' sheep, and catching, setting children on fire and stuff, and then they would go and plead their case to the king, and sort of depending on which king you got or which queen you got, you could get a very different answer, right? One of them might say, well, oh, that's horrible. It's our dragon, it's our responsibility. Here's some money to make up for your loss, or something like that. Where you can imagine another total, a Joffrey type king that's just like, well, what are you letting your children run around for? Don't you know there's dragons out there? Or why don't you hide your sheep from the dragons? That it's your stuff, it's your responsibility. And so you can imagine, different sort of FI values are going to come up with a very different solution to those sorts of problems. And even Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's like one of the most like famous, well-regarded judges of the early 1900s, he wrote a whole thing about the farmers potentially having contributory negligence, right? Like they need to be careful about where they stack their hay and how much grass they have, right? So that's all sort of beside the point. But what I'm trying to hopefully um, establish or make clear is that is FI stuff, right? That is not TI stuff. But in both senses, it's deliberation. It's trying to come up with an answer to a problem, a declarative problem. But um, but they go about it in different ways. One is weighing values and weighing fairness and trying to come up with what the person feels like is the most FI sort of solution, but the fairest solution. Where TI is going to be more about, okay, once we've, and I think this is what one of the commenters here on the live stream is saying, is once we've sort of figured out the framework, right, the FI framework, then we can sort of figure out sort of TI solutions, right? Um, and I would argue that, you would even bring in the TE part of it, right? How can we, what sort of steps do we need to take, or what do we need, the TE planning part? How do we sort of achieve whatever goal we're after now that we sort of know the framework? We've deliberated out the framework. So that leads me to my next point that the commenter makes. And they go on to talk about how using the non-aggressive principle would sort of quote unquote solve this problem. And yeah, I agree. And it's getting into the TI part of it. But you don't get there until you've established the FI part, right? Which principle are we going to use? Which framework are we going to use? Um, and they talk about buying and renting land. I don't think that's relevant or here. I mean, I see what they're saying, but in this case, there was no situation where the farmer or the railroad had to buy or rent the other person's land. It was merely just who's paying the damages, right? Or basically whose insurance company pays for it. And so, of course, the train company, they could use sort of a combination of TI. Well, let me back up here, because the more important point he makes is economic viability is TE, not TI. I disagree with that. I'll come back to that. You have to make something cost efficient, otherwise it's not sustainable. So TE becomes fair because TE is not forcing you to buy. TE just fixes problems in a free market and has a lot of competition. Okay, I think the issue here is sort of this understanding or this way of interpreting TE as being the thing that figures out what's most efficient, um, and or cost effective or whatever. And I would say a little bit of yes, a little bit of no. I think figuring out in a logical deliberation way, again, of what's going to be the most cost efficient way is going to be, heavily TI. Now, figuring out how to plan for, taking steps, like once we figure out, like, okay, um, the train, the railroad company's on the hook here. Now, what do they have to do? What steps do they have to do to fix the problem? So there are lots of different steps that they could take. They could just go out and buy more insurance. They could go to the person, the farm owners, and just buy up their land within 100 miles or however, within a few miles of the railroad, and solve the problem that way. Or they could, build better, protectors on their engines so that the sparks don't fly out as much. They could, go to purely non-combustible engine, go to electric or something, right? Now, obviously, that would be, you know, cost way too much and require way too much, and that's where the TI is probably going to come in and say, well, um, in, in its deliberative stage, right? So the TE is figuring out possible solutions, possible plans of solving the problem. What can we do? So, the TE is the planning, it's the figuring out the how, not necessarily the what, but the how. And there are lots of different things that you could do, and you could use your TE to sort of figure that out, but you're going to also need the TI to do the endpoint deliberation and say, okay, we're going to go with that plan, as opposed to, instead of trying to come up with an electrical, train, or a train that flies above the ground, we're going to spend our energy and our resources in, buying more insurance, or buying up the land, or building better protectors, that kind of stuff, on the train. So, everything, like I always say, nothing is ever in a vacuum. All of these functions are all interacting with each other. Um, and so it's important to sort of parse out, okay, what part of the problem are we talking about here? Are we talking about, establishing a general fairness framework? Okay, that's going to be an FI thing. Are we figuring out, okay, what's the most cost efficient way of doing this? Okay, that's probably a combination of TE, figuring out some, possible plans of attack, and then the TI deciding, okay, which one really saves us the most money, um, et cetera, et cetera. And then there also might be some FI deliberation that goes into that as well. Like, do we really want to, make our employees do all this stuff? Blah, 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 blah. And so again, you have to be thinking about specifically what process is going on, in these situations, because there's a lot of things that all sort of, add up and combine together. Okay. I think that's about it. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is that, again, there's sort of this law and economics approach where, you have the Chicago school out there with a bunch of judges and professors that all feel like, instead of figuring out a fairness principle or a fairness framework, we should just be using bare bone economics and figuring out, what is the most cost efficient, or, the best or most efficient, economically efficient answer, and go with that. And they feel like, because they feel like, if you leave it into a subjective FI realm, then you're going to have all these different judges with all these different FI principles coming up with a bunch of different, quote unquote, solutions to the same problem. Where if you use a more, economic based, what's the most efficient outcome, then you're going to have more consistency across the different court systems. And there's obviously something to it. These guys are obviously super bright, well accomplished, and they know what they're talking about. But I would also say, just taking that stance that we should be finding an economically efficient answer is itself an FI sort of decision, right? I mean, you can imagine there's plenty of other countries out there that don't want to find necessarily the most economic um, solution, but the solution that sort of protects the people or the country or whoever's in power, that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily the right answer. But but if we're thinking free market US, maybe. But again, there's going to be some TI deliberation there, that's going to have to figure out, okay, what's the most efficient, cost efficient solution. And just because it's economics doesn't mean it's TE. TE is about the planning. Once you've figured out which, are you going to go, which way you're going to go, sort of figuring out, okay, well, how do we get there? What are the steps? Okay, so I might say more on this, but I just wanted to make this quickly because I got the comment and wanted to make sure I clarify that stuff. I was expecting more people to sort of swoop in and say fairness is about FE and not FI, but I guess they haven't been coming yet. So we'll see. All right. A few comments here. Oh, okay, cool. The original commenters here. So let me look through these. Is there a spectrum of more wrong FI and more right FI? Well, I think the heavy FI users would tell you yes. I think that comes down to, is there an objective morality or a not, or is morality just sort of subjective? And I don't know. I have my own opinion on it, but I don't think you can answer it definitively one way or the other. I think in some respects there's a universal morality, but you know, but I acknowledge that there's a lot of people who disagree. Trains reliable for the spark damages. Would TE, with respect to TI, be applying changes to the trains to minimize the sparks? Yeah. So once we've figured out the groundwork, and the trains realize, okay, we're responsible now. We're the ones who are going to have to pay for the damage. Then yeah, I think it is going to be a combination of TE and TI figuring out a solution to that problem. Because now it's not about fairness, or any sort of ethical question. It's pure engineering, right? Or pure, financial planning, financial engineering. For example, maybe they just buy a little bit more insurance and they're fine, right? Or maybe they buy up the land that's close to the railroad, and it costs less than having to redo all their trains, right? Or they figure out, oh, all we have to do is put a cap on the engine, and that'll get rid of 99% of the problems, and then we buy insurance to cover the rest, right? So that's going to be a combination, I think, of TE, TI, TE doing sort of the planning, sort of the how do we do this, sort of the engineering part of it, and TI doing more of sort of the backroom operations of, okay, well, what's going to be more expensive, what's going to be cheapest, running the numbers, so to speak, is a very TI thing. Cost efficiency is TE analysis. Yeah, see, that's where you and I disagree. I don't, TE to me is doing planning. And I realize that everybody out there likes to characterize TE as being figuring out the cost efficient way. But to me, there's no difference of running the numbers in your head, in your TI part of your head, to figure out, okay, does plan A cost more than plan B? That is a TI conditional logic problem, right? And if you took, and the way we know that is that if you took a patient who has a fully functioning frontal lobe and you remove the sort of TI logic parsing part in their parietal lobe and various other structures, they can tell you the different plans. They could come up with the different plans. Like, you could buy insurance, you could, restructure, redesign the train, you could do stuff like that. That's a TE thing. But then when you say, okay, which one are we going to go with? What costs the most or the least? They can't do that math in their head, right? And then you also have people on the inverse where they have frontal lobe damage, and we have way more evidence of this. People with frontal lobe damage, up in their TE area, where they can't even figure out the possible steps to the plan, but they can do the math. If you gave them the math problem of what costs more and what costs less, they could figure that out, but they can't do the planning part of it. Okay. TEFI is an axis, so yeah, you use affix in conjunction. Yeah, again, this is probably where I deviate. Where I, mean, again, I'm one of these people who says you use all 8 functions, but you use them at different levels of sort of efficiency or ease. And so if you are a quote unquote TEFI access user, then yeah, it's going to be easier for you to use FI. It's going to be easier for you to use TE. But I don't necessarily think that it means that if you use TE, then you necessarily use TFI. It only matters if that's what you're computing. If you're computing that in that domain. Okay, objective reality, experiencing pain, more pain is bad, less pain is good. Real-world problems, there are many variables to optimize. You can reduce costs, save time, but you reach a point where you cannot improve one without losing the other. So FI is needed. Maybe. I mean, again, I think a lot of that is more TI, deliberation, as long as you're willing to sort of spin your deliberation wheels and try to come up with, the right quote unquote mathematical answer. It could probably stay in the TI domain, but FI, of course, can creep in there if it's starting, if you're starting to realize, well, doing it this way isn't really fair. Even though it might cost us less money, our employees are going to have to work twice as much, or I'm going to have to work twice as much, and we certainly don't want that. And so you might get these sort of fairness evaluations creeping in as well. And like I said in my other video, a lot of ESTJs, they're very TE planning focused, but when it comes down to do you go with plan A, plan B, or plan C, a lot of times they'll think, okay, well, what's the fairest here, right? So all things being equal, it's going to cost us the same amount of money, blah, 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 blah. They'll go into what's the fairest situation. Now, they might start off with more of a TI thing and sort of think like, okay, what's going to cost us the most money? And obviously ESTJs can use TI as well. And so they might, run the numbers in their head or ask somebody to run the numbers for them. But again, if you come back and you say, okay, it's basically going to cost us about the same, for each of these plans, which one do you want? Then they're going to look at it and say, okay, what's the fairest? What's the fairest to the other side? What's the fairest to my employees? What's the fairest to me, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so man with the great machete, I'm glad you stopped by. I do have to run. I'm happy to address anything that I didn't parse out or clarify here, but I'm glad you left the comment that you did, because it does allow me to sort of parse out things in a way that I hadn't really before in the previous video. So thanks everybody. Have a great one. See you soon.